This video that I'm making now um, has a lot to do with the lynchings and the lynching bill, and even today, how it's going on today with the Senate. And it's crazy, and how it started. And to point out to a lot of Americans that the South, the racist South, were devils. Thousands of them were nothing but devils. And this history that I'm about to reveal shows exactly who they are. And I tell you what, it hasn't much changed with the judges down in the South, the white judges. Um, they call themselves conservatives. They call themselves Republicans, not Lincoln's Republicans, the KKK Republicans, the racist Republicans that has went on for years and years up until 2005 and even going on today. What happens is we have these people from the South that ended up as judges, ended up as senators, governors, um, that were nothing but racist, straight racist, that condoned lynching. And it's still, like I said, it's still going on today with the racist Republican Party in the Senate and in the House. So, also, the reason why I'm doing it, one of the reasons why I started thinking about this was about Clarence Thomas. And when I started thinking about Clarence Thomas, I started thinking about history because he has known what was going on in history from when it even went on, from when all this was taking place. He knew the history of lynching of blacks and racism and everything else, and how he became a token nigger for the racist who would have just as easily strung his black ass up just as fast as any other black, and he still sinks to their level of the KKK and the racists that are in this country tonight today. So let me get to it, and please, if you start watching this video, please continue watching it. I know it's going to be hard to watch, especially for a lot of whites, you know, when they see just how their ancestors and their grandfathers and their fathers had treated people of color. Also, I just want the Jewish people to know I understand the Holocaust, but I want to show them that our history is so close to theirs when it comes to the Holocaust that you could not stick a thin piece of paper between the two. So let me get started with this. This video that I'm making now has a lot to do with the lynchings and the lynching bill, and even today, how it's going on today with the Senate. And it's crazy, and how it started. And to point out to a lot of Americans that the South, the racist South, were devils. Thousands of them were nothing but devils. And this history that I'm about to reveal shows exactly who they are. And I tell you what, it hasn't much changed with the judges down in the South, the white judges. They call themselves conservatives. They call themselves Republicans, not Lincoln's Republicans, the KKK Republicans, the racist Republicans that has went on for years and years up until 2005 and even going on today. What happens is we have these people from the South that ended up as judges, ended up as senators, governors, that were nothing but racist, straight racist, that condoned lynching. And it's still, like I said, it's still going on today with the racist Republican Party in the Senate and in the House. So, also, the reason why I'm doing it, one of the reasons why I started thinking about this was about Clarence Thomas. And when I started thinking about Clarence Thomas, I started thinking about history, because he has known what was going on in history from when it even went on, from when all this was taking place. He knew the history of lynching of blacks and racism and everything else, and how he became a token nigger for the racist, who would have just as easily strung his black ass up just as fast as any other black, and he still sinks to their level of the KKK and the racists that are in this country today. So let me get to it, and please, if you start watching this video, please continue watching it. I know it's going to be hard to watch, especially for a lot of whites, when they see just how their ancestors and their grandfathers and their fathers' fathers had treated people of color. Also, I just want the Jewish people to know I understand the Holocaust, but I want to show them that our history is so close to theirs when it comes to the Holocaust that you could not stick a thin piece of paper between the two. So let me get started with this.
Imagine you are holding a photograph. It is black and white, slightly blurred at the edges, the way photographs from the early 20th century tend to be. In the center of the frame, two men are hanging from the branch of a tree. Their bodies are limp. Their hands are tied behind their backs. Their necks are broken. But here's the thing that makes this photograph different from every other photograph of violence you have ever seen in your life. The crowd around them is smiling. Not a crowd of 2 or 3 people. Not a small group of men in hoods. A crowd of hundreds. Men in suits and ties. Women in church dresses. Children perched on their father's shoulders to get a better view. Teenagers grinning at the camera with the casual ease of people at a county fair. Some of them are looking directly into the lens. They want you to see them. They want you to know they were there. They are proud. This photograph was taken in Marion, Indiana, in August of 1930. The two men hanging from that tree were Thomas Shipp and Abner Smith, both black, both teenagers. They had been taken from the county jail by a mob of several thousand people, beaten nearly to death before they were even strung up, and then displayed for the better part of a night while the crowd grew and grew. Postcards were made from photographs like this one. They were sold. They were mailed. People wrote notes on the back. Vacation greetings, holiday wishes, sent through the United States Postal Service with a federal stamp. Now I want you to hold that image in your mind, not because I want you to suffer, but because what you need to understand right now, before we go a single step further, is that what we are about to talk about was not secret. It was not hidden. It was celebrated. And that is the thing that almost no one tells you. That is the fact that has been quietly buried under 70 years of American amnesia. The lynching era in the United States of America was not the work of fringe extremists operating in the shadows. It was not the action of a few deranged individuals that the rest of decent society condemned. It was a mass public institution. It was attended by thousands. It was photographed, printed, mailed, and sold as entertainment. And the people who carried it out, in thousands of towns across 32 states, almost never faced a single consequence. Between 1877 and 1950, at least 4,084 Black Americans were lynched in the American South alone. Let me say that again, because that number is easy to read too fast. 4,084 documented cases. In the South, in 73 years. That is one lynching every 6.5 days, every single day of every single year, for 7 decades. And the word documented is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, because historians who have spent careers studying this period believe the true total is significantly higher. Many killings were never recorded. Many were covered up by the very sheriffs and judges who were supposed to investigate them. Many happened in counties so remote and so hostile to outside inquiry that no one outside those counties ever learned of them at all. But here is the thing that I want you to sit with. Here is the thread that is going to run through everything we examine today. The question that historians have debated, that survivors carried in their bodies to their graves, and that the American government has still, as of this recording, never fully answered. Who was really running this? Because the evidence, the actual documentary evidence that was buried for decades, suggests that lynching in America was not primarily mob violence at all. Not in the way we have been taught to think about mobs. It was, in many places, in many counties, a coordinated system. It had participants in law enforcement. It had participants in local government. It had the silent approval, and often the active assistance, of state officials who had the power to stop it and chose not to. And there is a paper trail. There are telegrams. There are letters. There are newspaper editorials that functioned as open invitations to violence. There are sheriffs who conveniently stepped away from their jails on the nights mobs arrived. There are governors who received direct requests for intervention and did nothing. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the documented historical record. And by the end of what we are going to examine together, you are going to understand something that most Americans have never been taught, that the lynching era was not a failure of American justice. It was American justice, functioning exactly as it was designed to function for Black Americans living under Jim Crow. We begin in 1877. You have to understand what was destroyed first, because the lynching era did not emerge from nothing. It was a response. It was a weapon. And to understand what it was a weapon against, you need to understand what the years immediately after the Civil War actually looked like. Because here is something that the standard American education almost never teaches adequately. Reconstruction worked. Not perfectly. Not without violence. Not without enormous struggle. But in the years between 1865 and 1877, something genuinely extraordinary happened in the American South. Black men voted. Black men held political office. Black men served in state legislatures, in Congress, as sheriffs, as judges, as school board members. Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce represented Mississippi in the United States Senate. Joseph Rainey of South Carolina became the first Black congressman to serve in the House of Representatives. By 1870, over 700 Black men held elected office across the South. Let me say that clearly, so it lands properly. Less than 5 years after the end of chattel slavery, black men were serving as United States senators. And it was not just politics. Black communities across the South were building. Schools were established at a rate that astonished outside observers. Churches became the center of community life and political organizing simultaneously. Land was being purchased. Businesses were opening. Towns were incorporating. A class of black professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and ministers was emerging and growing. It was fragile, underfunded, opposed at every turn by white resistance, and operating under the constant threat of violence. But it was real, and it was gaining. This is what Reconstruction was, and this is what white Southern power could not tolerate. The terror campaigns against black political organizing did not begin after Reconstruction ended. They began while Reconstruction was still happening, while federal troops were still present, while the constitutional amendments were still new. The Ku Klux Klan, the White League, the Red Shirts, these were not spontaneous grassroots reactions to some perceived injustice. They were organized paramilitary operations designed specifically to do one thing: drive black Americans out of political and economic life by making the cost of participation in that life unbearable. They murdered black office holders. They burned black schools. They attacked black churches. They killed voters on their way to polling places and murdered the men who ran them. In Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873, a white paramilitary force massacred approximately 150 black men, many of them after they had already surrendered and left their bodies in the open for weeks. A federal prosecution followed. It reached the Supreme Court, and in 1876, the Supreme Court ruled in United States versus Cruikshank that the federal government could not protect black citizens from private violence. That individual states were responsible for their own citizens' safety, that the 14th Amendment only applied to state action, not private action. Think about what that ruling meant in practice. Think about what it meant in a state where the governor was aligned with the Klan, where the sheriffs were members of the White League, where the judges attended the same churches as the men who planned the killings. The Supreme Court had just told those men, the federal government will not stop you. You are on your own. Which, from the perspective of the men committing the violence, meant you are free. Then came 1877. The presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden ended in dispute. Electoral votes from 3 southern states were contested. The resolution was a political deal, the Compromise of 1877, that gave Hayes the presidency in exchange for the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. With the troops gone, Reconstruction was over. Not formally, not with a single announcement, but functionally, immediately, completely. The thin federal umbrella that had been protecting black political life in the South was folded up and taken away, and what followed was the most systematic rollback of civil rights in American history. Within 5 years, black voter registration in Mississippi dropped from almost 100% to nearly zero. Poll taxes were enacted. Literacy tests were invented and applied selectively. White primaries were established, making Republican Party membership irrelevant in one-party states. Constitutional amendments were circumvented. Laws were rewritten. And the enforcement mechanism for all of it, the tool that made disenfranchisement and economic subjugation stick, the instrument that made sure no black person would ever again risk asserting the rights that the Constitution technically still guaranteed, was terror. Specifically, the rope. I want to be very precise about something, because precision matters here. When we use the word lynching, we are not talking about one type of event. We are talking about a category that encompasses a range of actions, all of which share the same essential feature: extrajudicial killing carried out by a group with community knowledge and often community participation, designed to enforce a racial and economic hierarchy. Some lynchings were carried out in private, in the middle of the night, by small groups. A man taken from his home, a body found in a creek the next morning, a coroner who ruled it death by unknown causes and moved on. But the vast majority of documented lynchings in the peak decades of this era, from the 1880s through the 1920s, were public events, announced in advance, attended by crowds, reported in local newspapers, sometimes the same newspapers that had published the original accusation, sometimes the very same editors who had written the editorials calling for violence. Here is how it worked in practice. In the counties where it was most systematized, a black man would be accused of something. The charge was usually one of a small number of things. Assault on a white woman was the most common, and it is important to understand immediately that historians have established conclusively that in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, the accusation was false. Ida B. Wells, the journalist who would dedicate her life to documenting and fighting the lynching epidemic, published an investigation in 1892 called Southern Horrors, in which she demonstrated, using the public record, using the newspapers, using the statements of white witnesses, that the accusations of rape and assault that triggered the majority of lynchings were fabrications, sometimes completely invented, sometimes descriptions of consensual relationships that white family members refused to accept, sometimes cases of mistaken identity, sometimes the result of personal or economic disputes in which a false accusation was a convenient weapon. But there were other charges too. Talking back to a white man, touching a white woman accidentally, owning land that a white neighbor wanted, starting a business that competed with a white-owned one, voting, attempting to vote, organizing other black workers to demand fair wages, testifying against a white man in court, witnessing something a powerful white man did not want witnessed. The accusation, once made, moved through a specific sequence. The local newspaper would publish it in inflammatory terms. Words like fiend, brute, and monster were standard. Details were rarely verified. Named suspects were described as guilty before any proceeding had taken place. The editorial might note that the citizens of the county were understandably enraged, that they could hardly be expected to remain calm, that the law was slow and uncertain, that justice demanded something more immediate. This was not accidental language. It was an invitation. The sheriff would be notified that a mob was forming. Often the sheriff had been notified before the newspaper went to print. In case after case, documented case after documented case, the sheriff responded to this notification by making himself unavailable, by leaving town, by entrusting the jail to a single deputy who would unlock the door when the mob arrived, by claiming afterward that the crowd had been too large, too determined, too overwhelming to resist. None of these sheriffs were ever prosecuted. Many were re-elected. The mob would arrive. The prisoner would be taken. What followed was not always quick. Historians have documented cases in which victims were tortured for hours in front of crowds of thousands, in which body parts were removed as souvenirs, in which victims were burned alive while the crowd watched and cheered. These details are not included here for shock value. They are included because the scale and the spectacle of the violence was intentional. It was designed to be seen. It was designed to travel. It was designed to reach every black family in every surrounding county and communicate a single message with perfect clarity. This is what happens. This is what we will do, and no one will stop us. The body would be left hanging, sometimes for days. Sometimes the family would be prevented from retrieving it. Sometimes the body would be mutilated further after death. The local newspaper would run a follow-up article describing the event in the language of satisfied justice. Phrases like, "the community has spoken," and "swift retribution" appeared regularly. National wire services picked up many of these stories and distributed them across the country. And then, nothing. No arrests, no trials, no consequences. Because in virtually every county in the Deep South in the peak decades of the lynching era, the men in the mob were the same men who served on grand juries, who sat as judges, who wore the sheriff's badge, who wrote the newspaper editorials, who ran the banks that held black sharecroppers' debt, who owned the land that black tenant farmers worked. The system was not failing to respond to the violence. The system was the violence. 4,084 documented lynchings. That is the number compiled by the Equal Justice Initiative in their landmark 2015 report, Lynching in America, which remains the most comprehensive analysis of the historical record ever published. It covers 12 southern states from 1877 to 1950 and is based on contemporaneous newspaper accounts, court records, NAACP files, and academic research accumulated over more than a century. But the EJI's count is of the South only. When you add documented lynchings in northern and western states, the number rises substantially. Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kansas, California, Nebraska. Lynchings occurred in at least 32 of the 48 states that existed during the peak era. Mississippi had the highest documented total, 654. Over 650 murders, most of which resulted in 0 arrests and 0 prosecutions, in a single state over 7 decades. Georgia was second with 531, Texas with 492, Louisiana with 391, Alabama with 360. Certain counties were, by the historical record, killing fields. Leflore County, Mississippi, Yazoo County, Mississippi, Brooks County, Georgia. These were places where the terror was so thorough, so complete, that black residents understood their continued existence there to be conditional on total submission. Any assertion of rights, any departure from the enforced codes of deference, any economic success that exceeded what white neighbors considered acceptable could be, and frequently was, a death sentence. And here is something that is almost never taught. The victims were not only men. At least 159 black women were lynched in this period. Women accused of defending their husbands. Women accused of being accomplices to black men who had asserted themselves in some way. Women accused of nothing at all, killed simply because they were present when a mob came for the men and their families, and the mob did not want witnesses. Mary Turner, 8 months pregnant, was lynched in Brooks County, Georgia, in May of 1918, after she publicly protested the lynching of her husband. A crowd of several hundred people killed her in a manner so savage that the full details remain almost unprintable more than a century later. A local newspaper noted her death in 4 sentences. Children were lynched, teenagers were lynched, men in their 70s were lynched. And in at least 41% of documented cases, according to the EJI's analysis, the victims had not been accused of any criminal offense at all. They were killed for economic competition, for social assertion, for nothing more than the perceived failure to demonstrate adequate deference to a white person's authority. Now, I told you at the beginning that there is a mystery at the center of this story, a thread that has never been fully pulled, that leads somewhere that the American historical consensus has never quite been willing to go. Here it is. The United States Congress attempted to pass a federal anti-lynching bill more than 200 times between 1900 and 1952. More than 200 times. The bills were blocked every single time. Blocked specifically by Southern senators using a procedural tool you may recognize, the filibuster. Between 1922 and 1938 alone, 3 major anti-lynching bills passed the House of Representatives with substantial majorities and were killed in the Senate. The Dyer Bill of 1922, the Costigan-Wagner Act of 1934, the Gavigan-Wagner-Van Nuys Bill of 1938, each one killed by senators who stood on the Senate floor for hours, days, sometimes weeks, and talked and talked and talked until the bill died. These men had names. They had constituents. They had donors. They wrote letters and gave speeches and shook hands at fundraisers in Washington. They were not anonymous. They were not rogue actors. They were the senior elected representatives of American states, and they made an explicit, deliberate, documented, public choice to protect the right of their constituents to murder black Americans without federal interference. For 50 years, across multiple presidential administrations, through 2 world wars, and the federal government let them. No president between 1877 and 1952 made the passage of an anti-lynching law a priority. Not one. Woodrow Wilson, whose administration resegregated the federal government and screened The Birth of a Nation, a film that celebrated the Klan in the White House, actively opposed federal intervention. Franklin Roosevelt, who accepted black votes and black political support, refused to push for anti-lynching legislation because he needed Southern Democrats to pass his New Deal programs. The letter he wrote to NAACP Executive Secretary Walter White in 1934 explaining why he would not publicly support the Costigan-Wagner bill is one of the most devastating documents in American political history. The needs of the economy, he implied, outweighed the problem of black people being murdered. The United States Senate did not formally apologize for its repeated failure to pass anti-lynching legislation until 2005. Not 1965, not 1985, 2005. And even then, 80 senators did not sign the resolution. A formal federal anti-lynching law, designating lynching as a federal hate crime, was not signed into law until March of 2022. 2022, 145 years after the lynching era began. Now here is where I want to leave you for this first section, because I want you to sit with this question, the way the historians who uncovered this evidence have sat with it. If the lynching era was just mob violence, just eruptions of local hatred that no one could control, why did it require 50 years of sustained legislative effort to block a federal response? Why did it require the coordinated action of an entire wing of the United States Senate, wielding a specific procedural tool, again and again and again, across decades, to prevent the federal government from treating murder as murder? You block a law that hard, for that long, because you need the thing the law would prohibit. You need the terror to keep working. We are going to follow that thread. We are going to follow it through the specific men who ran this system, through the economics that made it essential to certain interests, through the documented cases that reveal its inner workings, through the people who risked and sacrificed everything to fight it, and through the question that has never been fully answered. Government know? When did it know it? And what did it decide to do about it? The answers are worse than most people have ever been told.
I will be posting the names of the senators that voted against the anti-lynching bill in 2022. I'm going to give you all the names of all the senators. I'm going to list them right here on my channel. This is just part one. I am going to be making part two to follow part one.